Hello and welcome back to Azure Terraformer. Today I'm going to do a little bit of module development and maybe not actually a lot of module development. I've done a little bit of that already. Maybe I just kind of want to show you a module that I just developed and show you how I plan on using it. This module was kind of the brainchild of kind of a live coding session that Matt White, a colleague of mine at Microsoft, and I did at HashiConf last year. We were literally at the Microsoft booth at HashiConf, just spitballing, chit-chatting about Terraform. And we came up with this idea of using the AzAPI provider to actually query data to help us access information about regions. Because there's a lot of APIs that are accessible that really aren't like built into the Azure RM provider. Now, maybe some of this stuff could be built in as those provider-based functions nowadays. So a lot of this could get wrapped inside of those provider-based functions. I think that would be really cool. But it is accessible through the AzAPI provider using this technique. So Matt published this module and I submitted a pull request on it. Matt chose to do some local caching and some things like that to kind of speed it up. I felt like I didn't want the local caching, so he politely declined due to backwards compatibility and things like that. So I decided to just kind of roll my own. I took the foundation that he had started, and I've been tweaking it. So that's what I was going to go through with you today. So this module actually has two data sources that it calls. Let's look at the code. The first is a data source where it's actually querying the Microsoft.compute provider. So this is a little bit hacktastic in the sense that there is no like divine API per se that will tell you like what all regions there are, what availability zones they are that they have. All of this data is kind of derived based on the CRP, or the compute resource provider, in order to determine what regions are supported. I mean, six half dozen the other. I mean, it both work. So from a pragmatic standpoint, we're achieving at the same end. It just feels like there probably should be an API that does this, in my opinion. But we're using the compute REST API in order to get this data. And basically, we're saying, hey, what regions can I provision VMs into, right? And that comes back with some data. And then there's also this locations API, which does provide some geographic data. It doesn't include the zones and what the capabilities are of the region. That's different. And I guess technically, that might be an RP construct, but the region itself, the structure of that region impacts other RPs besides CRP. It just so happens the CRP is the only resource provider that I'm aware of that publishes this data that we need. So what I've done is I've kind of refactored Matt's code that he published in his module, and I'll link that in the description below. I've kind of restructured it to add my own little flair in terms of the way that I organize code. I like to keep things, particularly locals that are related to each other, near the resource that they're referencing. So especially in cases where they only reference one resource, right, in our data source. I'm using that kind of interchangeably. So here, this local is basically processing the output data from this data source right up here. The compute provider output. And there's some machinations going on to kind of, process that data, flatten it, to list, kind of JSON decode it, organize it, and then massage the output values a little bit. I took that basically from the code that Matt published. I like it. It works. So I'm just going to kind of roll with that. So this does give a pretty good example. Like if you know the REST API and you want to go spelunking the REST API, this gives a good example of how you can use the AzAPI resource action data source to actually go hit that API, use the get operation. So, the data source is going to be, doing get operations. The resource would probably be doing maybe other HTTP verbs, I'm guessing. And so that's kind of how this works. And the locations is working the same. And again, we're massaging some data. Now, the structural things that I changed were I added input variables to do the filtering. I prefer this. I think it makes the module a little bit easier to understand and to control. Maybe different schools of thought on this, but I think it makes it more readable when you're using the module to see what filters you have as input variables. And so basically the modifications that I did is as I'm processing the data, I have kind of a two-step process where, I generate this all physical locations list, where I apply this filter. This is a filter that is being applied to the actual data that's coming back from that type. And then we output an object that looks like this with this structure. And then I'm basically using this list right here, all physical locations, and I'm iterating across that. And then I'm using the logical data structure that's output right here on lines 11 through 18. And I'm applying filters on that logical structure. So it's kind of like a data pipeline, right? Like one is processing the raw REST output, and then mapping that to a logical object, which is kind of the canonical data structure that we want, which is done here on lines 12 through 18. And then this is just a filter step that I'm doing, to the output of this object, where I can apply the input variable filters on all the things that I want. So the filters that I'm applying here are recommended regions. That was another design decision that I kind of differed from Matt, where he kind of had that built in, by default, like it would include recommended region only. It would only return recommended regions by default. I'm not a huge fan of that. I think my pull request requested that be like defaulted to false, because I think it should, that should be the natural behavior. Like if you want, to be more specific, like you should ask for it. And so I'm doing that here. I allow that to be, defaulted, to be false. If it is not false, then I'm only going to return items that, actually are recommended, flagged as recommended, which is a region. It's an actual region category. And so basically the recommend, I'm not exactly sure like who owns, this region category. But the recommended flag is basically, a qualitative attribute that Microsoft sets across all of the Azure regions that are basically saying, yeah, these are regions that 3P customers or third-party customers, right, would probably want to deploy to. So I kind of left that all. You can set this, by setting the flag, include only recommended regions. You can set that to true, and it'll always come back like that. What do you think? Do you think I should default that to true, or should I keep that defaulting to false? Let me know in the comments below. Then I have a variable for geography group, which is going to be like US, Europe, Canada, etc. And I apply that as a nullable input because it's a string. And I basically filter that out, right? And those are kind of the two big filters. And then of course there's the availability zones filter, which is a bool. And now I'm kind of breaking my own rules. I'm defaulting that to true, where I'm basically saying I'm requiring availability zones. Now I'm defaulting that to true mainly because it's best practice. Now, technically, the recommended regions is probably, you could probably make the same argument there. So I don't know. What do you think? Do you think I should stay consistent, default that to false, and then, allow you to override that to be more specific? Because it's basically doing the same function, but just on a different slice of the data. As opposed to recommended regions, I'm doing it based on regions that support availability zones. Let me know in the comments below. I would be open to considering changing the default there. So now this filter, I think I actually apply in a different location. Maybe not. So there's a little bit of a merge that happens. So we get data from these two locations, the compute provider and the locations provider, and then we merge those. And Matt had this kind of setup where that merging took place in one of these locals, and I created a two-step process. One where I do the merge and I don't apply any filters, and then the final step where I actually apply the filters. So here you can see I'm applying my filter on availability zones required. Of course, if that's set to false, then I ignore it, because if you don't require availability zones, I'm gonna return all the lists of all of the regions, whether they support availability zones or not. So it's an inclusive return there. And then if you do require availability zones, I'm only going to return you availability zones with a length of 0. Now I did change this. Instead of, I think Matt had this returning null if the region, if there were no zones. But I changed that to be an empty array because it made this filter that much just really easy. I was getting errors in the cases where there were no zones. It was null, and didn't really like this filter parameter. So so that's how it is. So here is my first sample. This is just a sample that does nothing. Let me go to that. It's just all output. I'll run Terraform init. And let's just see what this outputs. Now, I gave this as an example because this is going to return pretty much everything, all the data, all the things. So if you want to go and see everything in all its glory, in the kind of unmassaged output, right? Because there are different, Matt had several different ways of returning the data in maps, which I really like, and so I'm keeping that. But I thought the default example should just give you the raw output with no filters applied. Now the next example is my availability zones filter. So you can see here it's very clear, right, what's happening. Availability zones required, true, right? And so that's what I'm going to do. So let's go run that. Now this does get live data every single time, right? So you can see here all the zones list is populated on all of these guys. None of them have an empty list. Okay. I'm not going to go splunking that. Now let's just if I set this to false, of course I could, I think the default is true, right? So I have to set that to false. So now let's run it with availability zones required set to false. I want all the zones. I'm not going to be discriminating by availability zones. And so you can see here the notorious West US, which I famously included as very typo in one of my presentations on availability zones, I stupidly just used West US as the example region, even though it doesn't support zones currently. Oops. So anyways, and you can see recommended is false, and you can see recommended is true, right? So this is returning irrespective of recommended or not, irrespective of zones supported or not. Like, we're getting all of those things, right? Oh, and you can also see we're getting all geography groups, lots of different geography groups. So US, Asia Pacific, Europe, right? So we're not filtering by geography groups. That comes next. So the next example that I have is my geography group filter. So let's go do that one. And there we go. So I'm filtering by Europe. Okay. Matt should be proud. And you can see here we got North Europe, recommended true. We have UK South, recommended false, no zones. UK West, recommended true. This is all Matt's territory, right? Now we got Switzerland. Okay. So we got different things like that. Now, I could probably go add a geography filter as well. And I probably will. Maybe I'll do that on an upcoming video. So I think I do want to add a filter for geography, because you might want to really zone in on a very specific geography, not just a geography group. Like Europe. Yeah, I only want to be in Germany, or I only want to be in the UK. I think that makes sense. So we should do that. What other filters was I thinking about? I already have the recommended, so I think that's good. Yeah. I really don't see anything else to filter by. I mean, let me know what you think in the comments below. If you think of if you see there might be any other way you might want to filter these things, let me know. But really, it seems like geography would be the only other filter. So let's play around with this. Let's just make sure the filters worked well together. So I'm going to change this to only. So I'm requiring availability zones now, and I want only the regions in Europe that support availability zones. This is kind of why I went with this design choice, because to me it's more readable. Like it makes more sense. I know what I'm getting. So you can see here we're in Europe. Yep, we're in Europe. We got zones in Europe, zones in Europe, zones in Europe. Fabulous. So I can change this to US, and we should see only regions in the US that have zones, and should be good. Let's see. Yeah, there you go. So I'm in the US and I've got zones. The US, I've got zones. And West US is not in this list because it doesn't have zones today. There you go. Yeah, so there you have it. This is my take on the similar module that Matt produced. Matt has local caching and stuff like that, which I just feel like kind of adds a little bit of complexity and kind of destabilizes the module from my experience. That's my humble opinion. So I'm creating this module. I'm going to put it out there, and you guys let me know if you like it. But kudos to Matt for taking that skunkworks little coding exercise that we were doing together at HashiConf and like making that module. I just wanted to make one for myself because, you'll see in a future episode. But anyways, that's it for me. I hope you enjoyed this little deep dive into the, very interesting use of the AzAPI provider, hitting REST APIs using the get HTTP verb, processing the output, and then applying some filters, doing some data transformation, and then creating some pretty consumable data. All of this, of course, we could wrap this into an Azure RM, provider native function. Is that what they're called? And then you wouldn't even have to use, this module. You could just call the function and it would basically do the same thing, call this REST API. Anyways, if you know Go, take a crack at that. I would use it. I think that would be super cool. Anyways, I hope you found this useful. If you enjoy this content, please smash that like button and consider subscribing to the channel. It really helps out a lot. Also, if you haven't yet, consider joining and declaring yourself as an official Azure Terraformer. It really helps out the channel and help me continue to do what I do. So anyways, that's it for me. This is the Azure Terraformer signing off.